Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime.
The summer of 1951 in Cleveland, Ohio, was thick with the kind of oppressive heat that drove entire neighborhoods out of their stifling homes and onto their front porches in search of a faint evening breeze. It was an era often painted in the nostalgic hues of post-war innocence, a time when doors remained perpetually unlocked, and children roamed the city streets freely until the neighborhood streetlights flickered to life. Yet beneath this tranquil veneer of mid-century American security, a profound and calculating darkness was waiting to strike. On the humid evening of August 24th, 1951, that darkness silently descended upon the tight-knit enclave of the West Side, swallowing a 10-year-old girl named Beverly Potts without leaving one single trace behind. Her abrupt disappearance remains one of the most chilling, baffling, and relentlessly haunting unsolved mysteries in the extensive annals of true crime history. This narrative is a dark, suffocating descent into a mystery that utterly shattered the quiet security of a bustling industrial city and left a gaping wound that has refused to heal for precisely 75 years. When Beverly vanished into the heavy night air, she did not merely leave behind an empty bed and a frantic family. She left behind a ghostly void that has aggressively defied every attempt at logical explanation, every grueling police interrogation, and every desperate plea for answers. The sheer suddenness and absolute silence of her vanishing acts as a terrifying reminder that pure evil does not always announce itself with a chaotic roar. Sometimes it slips in quietly, effortlessly navigating through the shifting shadows of a crowded public park, silently erasing a vibrant life while the rest of the world is completely distracted, looking the other way. Beverly Potts was the absolute embodiment of radiant 1950s youth. At exactly 10 years of age, she possessed a bright, infectious smile, framed by neatly parted light brown hair that constantly fell into her eyes as she played. She was widely known throughout her community to be a deeply responsible, cautious, and intensely beloved child. She lived with her father, Robert, her mother, Elizabeth, and her older sister, Anita, in an immaculate, modest house situated on Linnet Avenue. Robert was a dedicated, hard-working man who provided for his family, and Elizabeth was a fiercely devoted mother who meticulously sewed many of Beverly's colorful dresses and skirts. To truly grasp the devastating tragedy of Beverly's ultimate fate, a person must initially understand the insulated microcosm of her daily world. The Potts residence on Linnet Avenue was located merely 2 short blocks away from Halloran Park, which served as the beating, vital heart of the entire West Side community. In the long days before the advent of residential air conditioning and digital entertainment, Halloran Park was the ultimate necessary sanctuary for the working class. It was a sprawling, meticulously maintained green expanse where large families gathered for weekend picnics, teenagers nervously flirted by the baseball bleachers, and young, energetic children chased glowing fireflies deep into the twilight hours. For Beverly, this park was merely an extension of her own personal backyard. She intimately knew every paved pathway, every towering oak tree, and every familiar, smiling face that regularly frequented the grassy grounds. It was heavily regarded as a place of supreme unshakable safety, a communal living room overseen by literally hundreds of watchful neighborly eyes. Yet this comforting illusion of absolute security was precisely what made the horrific events of that fateful Friday night so utterly incomprehensible. The calculating predator who took Beverly did not snatch her from a desolate, dangerous, and poorly lit alleyway in the dead of the night. They brazenly abducted her from the vibrant, pulsing center of her own neighborhood, surrounded by the loud laughter and casual chatter of her own friends and neighbors. This staggering, terrifying audacity adds a chilling, suffocating layer of suspense to the historical narrative, prompting the horrifying, stomach-churning realization that the monster was not lurking in the distant, frightening unknown, but was patiently hiding in plain sight. The 24th of August began just like any other sultry, predictable Friday in Cleveland. The growing anticipation in the neighborhood, however, was incredibly palpable by the late afternoon. That specific evening, Halloran Park was scheduled to host the heavily advertised Showboat, a massive, traveling, open-air talent show generously sponsored by the city's recreation department. These theatrical events were major local spectacles, reliably drawing massive, excited crowds from all the surrounding city blocks. Beverly had been eagerly anticipating this specific performance for over 3 weeks. Immediately after a quiet family dinner, she excitedly asked her parents for permission to attend the talent show with her close friend and next-door neighbor, Patricia Romito. Given that the park was just 2 streets away, and the entire event would undoubtedly be swarming with familiar protective faces, Robert and Elizabeth agreed to the request without one moment of hesitation. They sternly instructed their 10-year-old daughter to be home promptly after the final musical act concluded. Beverly, happily dressed in a bright red skirt, a crisp white blouse, and a pair of sturdy blue jeans rolled up at the cuffs, skipped out of her front door, her pockets holding precisely 15 cents to purchase a sweet treat. She quickly met up with Patricia, and the 2 young girls joyfully joined the immense, swelling tide of pedestrians making their enthusiastic way toward the bright, festooned lights of Halloran Park. By the time the 2 girls finally arrived at the location, the park was already teeming with chaotic life. An estimated massive crowd of over 1,500 local people had gathered closely together on the sloping, grassy hills to enthusiastically watch the amateur singers, dancers, and comedians perform on the brightly lit makeshift wooden stage. The festive atmosphere was completely electric, heavily filled with a salty aroma of freshly roasted peanuts. The deafening sound of continuous applause and the innocent, joyful chatter of a tight-knit community completely at leisure. As the hot summer sun finally dipped below the distant horizon, casting long, menacing, and distorted shadows across the dark perimeter of the park, the brilliant, blinding floodlights illuminated the center stage, creating a stark, blinding contrast against the rapidly encroaching darkness. Beverly and Patricia aggressively pushed their way to find a fantastic spot near the very front of the crowd, becoming completely engrossed in the amateur entertainment, entirely oblivious to the unseen, malevolent danger waiting for them. As the glowing hands of the park clock crept ominously toward 9 p.m., the shifting dynamics of the massive crowd slowly began to change. The initial explosive excitement was noticeably wearing off for some of the younger attendees and exhausted parents began rounding up their sleepy, irritable children to begin the short, dark trek back to their respective homes. Patricia Romito, heavily feeling the intense fatigue of the long, overstimulating evening, firmly decided she had seen enough of the performances. She turned to Beverly and quietly suggested they leave the park together. However, Beverly, utterly and completely captivated by the unfolding musical act on the stage, desperately wanted to stay for just one more song. She earnestly promised Patricia she would follow directly behind her in just a few short minutes. With a casual, fleeting goodbye that would later violently haunt her every waking moment for the rest of her natural life, Patricia turned her back and walked away toward Linnet Avenue, leaving Beverly standing completely alone in the dense, shifting throng of adult spectators. This seemingly insignificant decision tragically became the critical, terrifying juncture where Beverly's timeline violently fractured into the terrifying unknown. The talent show officially concluded its final act at exactly 9:30 p.m. Suddenly, the massive stage floodlights were abruptly extinguished, instantly plunging the crowded park into a sudden, highly disorienting and heavy gloom. The massive crowd of 1,500 tired people simultaneously rose to their feet, blindly dispersing in tens of different conflicting directions, instantly creating a chaotic, churning, and confusing sea of moving bodies in the pitch blackness. It was precisely within this specific blinding moment of mass movement and rapidly fading light that Beverly Potts simply evaporated from the physical face of the earth. Nobody heard one single piercing scream. Nobody witnessed a violent physical struggle. Nobody saw a strange lurking man physically dragging a panicked child into a waiting, idling vehicle. The bright 10-year-old girl wearing her highly visible bright red skirt was instantly and completely swallowed by the hungry night. The absolute, deafening silence surrounding her brutal abduction remains the most terrifying, incomprehensible aspect of the entire case. It heavily implies a predator of chilling, unmatched efficiency, a person who perhaps successfully lured her away into the shadows with a familiar, trusted voice, a cleverly constructed false promise, or a quiet, incredibly swift threat of violence that instantly paralyzed her with absolute fear. Back at the quiet Potts residence, Robert and Elizabeth were nervously watching the clock on the wall. 9:30 p.m. quickly came and passed without a single sound from the front porch. The dark streets outside their living room window slowly began to fill with the familiar sounds of neighbors casually returning from the park festivities. They clearly heard the distant laughter, the sharp slamming of wooden screen doors, and the heavy footsteps fading into the distance, but they absolutely did not hear the light, incredibly quick footsteps of their youngest daughter. By exactly 10 p.m., a cold, creeping dread began to heavily settle deep in the pit of Elizabeth's stomach. Beverly was never, ever late. She was a strict rule follower, a highly obedient girl who deeply respected her parents' established boundaries. Robert, desperately attempting to quell his own rapidly rising panic, forcefully grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and quickly walked the 2 short blocks directly to Halloran Park. When he finally arrived, the desolate scene that greeted him was a stark, horrifying contrast to the vibrant festival from exactly 1 hour prior. The sprawling park was now virtually deserted and intensely quiet. The large wooden stage was completely empty. The towering floodlights were dead and dark, and the expansive green lawns were entirely swallowed by thick, impenetrable shadows. The heavy, dead silence violently screamed at him. Robert frantically swept the bright beam of his flashlight across the empty wooden bleachers, deeply behind the thick trunks of the oak trees, and heavily along the paved concrete pathways, screaming Beverly's name out loud into the vast void. The only response he received was the mocking rustling of the evening wind blowing through the high branches. The crushing realization that his beloved daughter was genuinely gone struck his body with the brutal force of a physical blow. He immediately sprinted back to his house, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and immediately dialed the telephone operator to urgently connect with the Cleveland Police Department. The living nightmare had officially begun. The agonizing hours between midnight and the early dawn were a chaotic blur of desperate, frantic action. Hundreds of neighbors were violently roused from their warm beds, hastily pulling on their clothes and grabbing their flashlights to blindly join the massive search, desperately scouring the dense ravines that bordered the neighborhood. The immediate, forceful response from the Cleveland Police Department was completely unprecedented in its massive scale and intense, focused intensity. By the late afternoon of August 25th, the terrifying disappearance of Beverly Potts was absolutely no longer just a minor local concern. It was a highly publicized, city-wide state of absolute emergency. Well over 500 heavily armed police officers, seasoned detectives, and dedicated civilian volunteers were immediately mobilized, quickly forming one of the absolute largest, most comprehensive search parties in the entire history of the state of Ohio. They efficiently operated out of a chaotic, makeshift command center, systematically and thoroughly gridding the entire sprawling expanse of the West Side. Tens of local Boy Scout troops, hundreds of off-duty firemen, and literally thousands of terrified, highly motivated, ordinary citizens walked shoulder to shoulder through many miles of heavily wooded areas, dangerous, active railroad tracks, and highly toxic, abandoned industrial factory sites. Exhausted detectives aggressively knocked on well over 3,000 heavy doors in the immediate vicinity of Halloran Park, aggressively interviewing absolutely any person who had attended the showboat performance the previous night. Despite this truly Herculean, deeply exhaustive effort, the massive criminal investigation quickly and violently hit a terrifying, impenetrable brick wall. There was absolutely no physical evidence to be found. They discovered no discarded articles of clothing, no recognizable footprints in the dirt, no drops of human blood stains, and exactly zero credible eyewitnesses. It was completely as if Beverly had been violently plucked from the physical surface of the earth by a dark, invisible phantom. The absolute, staggering lack of physical clues quickly birthed a highly suffocating, dangerous atmosphere of intense community paranoia. Every single unfamiliar stranger was immediately viewed as a prime suspect. Every slow-passing passenger car was viewed with deep, aggressive suspicion. The police department switchboards were completely flooded with well over 10,000 phone tips from the terrified public, yet every lead turned to ash. Exactly 75 long years have passed since that tragic August night in 1951, yet the ghost of Beverly Potts continues to haunt the quiet streets of Cleveland. Her devastated parents eventually passed away, taking their crushing grief to their graves, never knowing the final fate of their beautiful 10-year-old daughter. The massive criminal case remains officially open to this very day, heavily standing as a chilling monument to the absolute limitations of human justice. The heavy police files, now deeply yellowed and brittle with extreme age, quietly sit in dusty archives, heavily guarding the terrifying secrets of a violent mystery. The unsolved disappearance of Beverly Potts fundamentally and permanently altered the deep psychological landscape of the entire city. It violently marked the brutal end of an era of American innocence. To look back at the unexplained events of August 24th is to deeply stare into a massive, terrifying black abyss of entirely unanswered questions. Exactly who was the invisible predator hiding in the massive crowd? And exactly where did they permanently hide the terrifying truth? The elusive answers remain permanently locked in the dark, entirely swallowed by the exact same unforgiving night that claimed Beverly Potts 75 years ago.